This video is going to be my long-term review of the VelociRAX. I'll talk about why I prefer this rack now for carrying 4 bikes and sometimes even 3 bikes. I just got back from a 1,700-mile road trip that we covered within 1 week, and I used this rack. I debated whether or not I would take this one or the Quicker Stuff Mach 2, and I chose this rack, and I'm glad I did, and I'll talk about it in this video. Now, if you've watched my videos on the Quicker Stuff Mach 2, you'll know I'm a huge fan of that rack. It is still my favorite rack on a daily basis for a couple of reasons. One is how easy it is to take on and off the vehicle, especially with just one tray. And then how easy it is to add other trays. So when I ride with a friend, with my wife, with my son, I can just add another tray really quickly. So like I said, I chose this rack for the trip that I just went on, and here are the 2 main reasons I did. First of all, the leverage that you put on a vehicle when adding additional trays really goes up, especially with mountain bikes. I put the 4 trays on the Quicker Stuff Mach 2, and I realized that the rack was pretty wobbly. There's a lot of movement with 4 mountain bikes. Now, with 4 road bikes, it's probably not near as much of an issue. But again, as you add those additional trays, by the time you get to that 4th tray, you've added a ton of leverage. We were carrying 3 basically 30+ pound mountain bikes and a dirt jumper, and that was just, it's a lot of weight. Now, we were well within Quicker Stuff's recommendation of weight limit. However, I just didn't feel comfortable with that much leverage on my vehicle and on the rack over bumpy roads. So we drove on gravel roads with potholes, and you're bouncing. Again, if it were 3 road bikes, I would have less of a concern. The advantage of these vertical bike racks, like the VelociRAX, is the fact that you're not adding any more distance from the vehicle, no matter how many bikes you carry, whether it's 1 or 7. Now, this is the 4 bike version, but you can carry up to 7. And so that center of mass stays the same, whereas with a traditional horizontal rack, that center of mass goes out the more bikes you add. The other reason I chose this rack, and I'm really glad I did, is because of how easy you can access the back. Now, I'll put some bikes on here in a minute and show you exactly what I mean. And I covered this in my initial videos of this rack. When I put the Quicker Stuff Mach 2 on the vehicle, and when I added a 3rd and 4th tray, it was really hard to pull that lever out to lower the rack down to access the back of the vehicle. In fact, I used that rack earlier this summer in the 3 bike configuration, and it was really hard to get that lever out. When I was getting ready for this trip and I added the 4th tray on, I literally could not pull that lever out with no bikes on. And so that was kind of a deal breaker. I didn't have time to really mess with putting some lube on the rack and trying to make that easier. I just said, forget about it. Let's use the VelociRAX because of how easy I can drop it down and access the back. Now, on a trip like this, we stayed in 3 different Airbnbs throughout the trip, and so you're constantly loading and unloading, and there are times where you may just need to access something in the back, whether it's, you know, a pump or a tool bag. And with 4 bikes on, 1 bike on, whatever, this thing will just drop down. I can access the back, I can push it back up, done deal. Even with other 4 bike racks like the Kuat NV 2.0, when you have 4 bikes on, it's heavy and it hits the ground when you lower it down. This bike rack is so easy just to drop down and access the back. So I'm gonna load some bikes on here, and I'll talk about a few of the features, again, that I like about the rack and why it just performed flawlessly. I mean, literally flawlessly on this trip after 1,700 miles. I'll go ahead and drop this down just by pulling on this lever. Now, with no bikes on, you do have to kind of pull on it to get it to come down to load a bike on, just because there's no weight and those dampers are pretty strong. But again, one of the reasons I love this rack is how easy it is to load bikes. And you can load bikes super quickly. You just walk it up, put it on. And like I mentioned in the first video, you do have to make sure the bikes don't swing into each other. It's not really an issue. It's just something you don't want to just kind of throw the bike up there and just let it swing around. And it's so easy to do these straps. And so that bike is loaded. And then I'm going to go ahead and load another bike, and I'm going to talk about something that I did that was just a precautionary measure. I probably didn't have to, and I'll show you what I mean. Loading the second bike, and by the way, when you load the bikes, you always want to make sure you load the left bike first, so there's no handlebar contact when you put the bikes on. So to make sure that front wheel drops into the basket all the way down, do your straps. I did this like 100 times on this trip. I got really quick at doing these straps and putting the bikes on. And then we'll just push them up against the vehicle, locks into place. Another thing that I really like about this rack is I do not have to worry about bikes making contact. Now you can see in this mountain bike configuration, I've got plenty of space between the brake lever and the top tube. Now, like I showed in some of my other videos, there are some configurations where you got to move bikes around, but the configuration that we ran, which is 3 mountain bikes and then a dirt jumper on the far right, we had no contact issues at all. However, just as a precautionary measure, what I did for this road trip is I took some pipe insulation, wrapped some Velcro around it and put it on the top tube just in case I were to ever hit a bump where this bike went this way and this bike went this way and they made contact. I don't think that would happen because even just pushing hard on this bike, it's hard to make them come close enough to make contact, but I wanted to use extra precaution. So take that into consideration. Now, VelociRAX does recommend, if you want to completely reduce the movement of the bikes, is to put something on the brake lever like a rubber band that holds down the brake lever to minimize the bikes kind of bouncing around on the rack. I did not do that for the big trip that I just got off of, and I did not regret it. The bikes really don't move around a whole lot. If you go by a semi truck, or again, you're going over a really bumpy road, you can look back and see the bikes just kind of moving around some, but you know, it's minimal, and they're resting on rubber tires, right? So there's going to be some bounce on the tires. Now, I will say, you do need to make sure you've got enough air in your tire. This particular bike is having a problem with a slow leak in the front tire, so I have to pump it up before every ride. And if I let the bike sit for a couple of days, I do need to pump up the tire before I put it on the rack. If the tire deflated, it's not like it's going to fall off the rack, whereas some other bike racks, that might be an issue. With this one, you know, you're just going to have a bike that may move around a little bit more. It may slide over, like it may tilt a little bit more, but it's not going to fall off the rack. That is not a risk. And that, you know, again, that's another thing about this rack is over bumpy roads and on interstate, I have no concerns about bikes coming off. And they sit down in those wheel baskets and you've got the rubber strap to hold them down. I have 100% confidence that bikes are going to stay on this rack, and I can't say that about every bike rack that I've used. Now, the quicker stuff that I mentioned, I don't have really any concerns. However, you know, if the tire went flat, if you had both tires go flat on bike racks like the One Up or the quicker stuff, you may have a risk of a bike coming off the rack. But I've never had it happen, I've never heard of it, but it's just a consideration. With this one, the front tire is just going to sit a little bit lower in that basket, but there's no risk of it coming out. As I mentioned earlier, lowering the bikes down to access the back is one of the huge benefits of this rack. So there's the lever that you pull, and so sometimes you may have to just pull up on the rack a little bit to take some pressure off of that pin, but it's really easy to do. Just doesn't take much force. And then they drop down slowly because of the damper, and then I can just access the back. Tons of clearance, no risk at all of this contacting any of the wheels, and I can access the back of the vehicle. And like I said, we did that more times than I can even remember for this trip, and so easy. Now again, with traditional horizontal racks, with 4 bikes on, raising and lowering the rack is not as easy because of the weight, and also because the rack usually will touch the ground. Then you got to worry about it, especially the Kuat. You know, it had the tool, the work stand in the back, and I was worried about that hitting the ground. I put like a towel down to make sure it didn't get scratched and that kind of thing, and then lifting it back up, pretty heavy. Also kind of difficult to access the lever on that one to lower the rack. And of course the quicker stuff, Mach 2, with 4 bikes on, I don't think I would have been able to pull out the lever at all. That is honestly the only negative I've really found about that rack, is just the difficulty of pulling that lever out. Even in the 1 or 2 bike configuration, it just takes some effort there at times. That's why now for carrying 4 bikes, I'm going to use the VelociRAX. You know, sometimes even 3. Like if I'm carrying 3 mountain bikes and I have a few extra minutes to put this on the vehicle. And let me talk about that. So this rack you can carry by yourself. So you can kind of put your shoulders under the rack and lift up on this part, and carry this rack by yourself. Now obviously if you're carrying 3 or 4 bikes, you have someone else with you, and you know, it's easier to have someone help you, but you can do that. I loaded this thing up by myself because I went to pick up my son in West Virginia and he wasn't here to help me. And I was able to put this on the vehicle by myself. You know, another thing I love about this rack, and I mentioned in my original video, is the fact that you can use it as bike storage in your garage when it's not in your vehicles. Obviously, I've become a huge fan of this rack, and I'm going to be using this for my bike trips when it's me and, you know, a couple other people. The last thing I'll talk about is the locks. So what I do is I carry a cable. So I have this 15-foot cable. It's plastic coated, and so it doesn't scratch the bikes or anything like that, and I keep a combination lock with it, and that's how I lock up the bikes. So you do have a little bar on the rack that you can run the cable through. VelociRAX makes an accessory now that puts the locks up here, so you can have locks stored within the bike rack. I just haven't done it yet, and I already had this, so I'm just going to keep using this. Another advantage of this is you may get to situations where you have the bikes off the vehicle and you want to lock them up. I had a couple situations like that on this trip, and I had the cable with me and I was able just to lock up the bike. So, you know, it's up to you. You can purchase that extra accessory that VelociRAX now makes and store it up here in the top bar. Those are my thoughts that I wanted to share on the VelociRAX fresh off a big road trip. Like I said, I'll be using this rack from now on for carrying 4 mountain bikes. If there's anything that I haven't covered in my videos of the VelociRAX, drop those questions in the comments below and I'll try to get to them. If you want to watch some of the other videos that I made with this rack, click on the cards that I'll put in this video. As always, thanks for watching.